winter. A witch is in control. The witch rules the land. And part of this early problem is that Edmund becomes a betrayer. The loss of Edmund's soul. At this moment, though, you just saw the sacrifice of Aslan the king. The king that if the white witch had looked at him, he could have actually taken her down with one swipe of his paw. But he doesn't do that. How unexpected to allow himself to be bound, shaved and humiliated, tortured, and murdered. And even though it said multiple times in the passage that they were surprised that he didn't move, that he did not stop it, and at any point he could have. What does this story remind you of? Jesus. How many things did you notice that were like Christ in this last passage? Let's start from the beginning. Susan and Lucy are walking with him, and he says, "Be with me." How many people did Jesus take with him? On the Mount of Transfiguration, how many people were supposed to be praying? 3. Here, it's 2 little girls. Okay? And he actually just wants the comfort of them being close. Jesus wants the comfort of them praying for him. He says, "Be with me," and they, for the first time ever, they feel close enough to actually touch the king. Close. An intimacy there. Okay? They get close, and he's sad. He is now walking away. Should give you the feeling as he's going through the pasture land, as he's getting ready to go. He's not to the stone table yet, but as he's walking through, they describe the feeling of the walking through the meadow, through the bushes, through the forest. You should start to see a feeling of the landscape. It should give you a little bit of a feeling of the Garden of Gethsemane. A little bit of foreshadowing as now he's sad. And his head is drooping. In fact, his head droops so low that a lion doesn't usually have his head touching all the way down to the ground. When your head is to the ground, what does that immediately make you think of? If you were to all of a sudden put your head to the ground, what would you be thinking of? Other than sleep or passing out?
Praying on my face.
Prayer on your face. And so, it actually describes in the passage, he is so sad, now his head is drooping all the way down, and his nose is now just rustling the tops of the grass as he's walking. Okay, this should give you the image of the sadness of the Garden of Gethsemane. Then he comes up and he says, "Now you wait here. You wait here." Where is that? When he tells him, "You wait here," what does that give you the image of?
Talking to the disciples.
The disciples. The disciples are not with Christ when he's taken. Right? Now, granted, many of them ran off and even denied their Savior, but they were not going to partake in what was about to happen. Okay? He delivers himself up, and he comes to the table, and they immediately want to knock him down. Why? He was already there. He wasn't going anywhere. Why did they need to knock him down?
They still fear his power.
Still fear his power. What did they do to Christ? No, not even before that. Before that, what do?
They flog him with crown thorns.
They flog him, and they bind him, and they whip him, they scourge him the night before. Okay? Then he is shaved. They brought in a thing about being shaved, a lion being shaved. Imagine a drenched cat being shaved. Okay? Taking his clothing. Right? Because it was it was to be a shameful experience. All right? So it was not just the pain and the suffering, it was a shameful experience. Okay? Now they tie him up. So you have the feeling of being tied to the cross, you have him being shaved. Now what happens? Because some of them were afraid. Some of them were afraid to do something. But there's something that actually happens when you're so angry. You're so angry that someone can be taken down. And all of a sudden it says, those that were afraid, as soon as he was down and tied and shaved, once he was demeaned, then all of a sudden they get in on the action and they start beating him. What is that?
Cowardice, right?
Yeah, they're being the cowards are now coming to thinking they're going to bare their teeth in the thing. Then all of a sudden, right before the white witch delivers the blow, she leans down. What is that? She leans down. What does she say? And now who is one? Fool, do you think that by all this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you are dead, what will prevent me from killing him as well? Who is this?
Satan saying that today,
Satan,
thinking that he was
thinking that he was winning at the cross. Okay? That literally, that Jesus was going to allow himself, the Son of God, to be killed. Doesn't make sense. Jesus was powerful. He could have jumped off of that cross, but he did not. He could have actually wiped him out with a word. With a flick of his pinky finger, there would have been nothing left of the Romans. And yet he stayed, just like Aslan's powerful line, stays there out of something. We have to figure out what that is in a moment. But why? Why, if there's such power, would the lions stay there? I mean, Christ stay on the cross. That does not make sense. If this is the same creator who made Niagara Falls, who put the stars in their courses, put the sun in place, why is a wooden beam so hard to overcome?
there was a plan, there was a
It was part of the plan.
There was what?
It was part of the plan.
What plan?
You want to do the will of his Father?
So when the White Witch, and this is where you find out, this is the whole important part of the story. Because Aslan's story, just like Christ, isn't over at the stone table. Something is getting ready to happen. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings. The great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is the lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Oh, hold on, this is Gaga. You got this?
Or is that the wrong page?
Yeah, wrong page. So it picks up that.
This one picks up right. Okay. This is like got doubled up apparently. Okay, thank you. I was like, that's wrong. That's story.
I don't know, we're lost.
Hold on.
After the
Henry
flurry of foul
Blackness.
winds,
Certainly I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son,
just turn the page.
Is that right? Yeah,
son of
that's
black
right.
of a, and no.
They must have gotten.
You know,
No, the one before.
Okay, well hold on. So what you need to know is that all of a sudden the girls are afraid, and literally there is a shaking of the ground with this thunderous herd that is ready to go to war. A thunderous herd, a shaking of the ground. What happened at Christ's crucifixion?
Like an earthquake or-
There's a shaking of the ground. Okay? And there is a blackness that overcomes the land. It's like literally the bats and the wild vermin are going to be flying overhead in the story. Right as she starts to leave, the vermin just are flooded in this nighttime. And so they're flying overhead in the darkness. Even the moon is covered up by all the vermin that are flying by. And that gives you the semblance of the sun going dark in the middle of the day. So all of these things C.S. Lewis puts into the story, they should be jumping out at you. But the most important is why Aslan does it. Why does Aslan allow himself to be killed? And it's to save a little boy. This boy who has chosen evil. This boy that now belongs to the White Witch. He takes his place. Now this is where the literature of the story comes into play. How could a small child, even a 10-year-old, how would a grown man understand how someone so powerful and so strong could make themselves so lowly to climb on a cross and die shamefully and painfully for someone who really stinks? We are people who are literally stenched in our own sin. And yet, the Son of the Most High God allowed himself to be beaten, scourged, shamed, humiliated, tortured, and murdered for you, for me. And that's what the story presents, is this little boy who was chosen wrong, just like you and I have chosen wrong, just like you and I have chosen sin. And yet, even though we deserve that same death the white witch is talking about, just as we have also, for the wages of sin is death. But the king has a different plan. And the king comes in and has a plan to save you at his own expense. It's hard to understand, hard to wrap ourselves around. Because, it's hard enough to imagine dying for a good man. Right? If you put your life on the line for a brother in combat, or a brother in war, all right? Or maybe for a good man, you might lay down your life if you're going to save someone who's going to change the world. But if you're going to lay down your life for a killer, would you lay your life down for a thief? How about a con man? How about an adulterer? How about a drug dealer? How about a guy who opens up fire at school? Would you lay your life down for him? That's what Jesus did. And here we can finally get to see a glimmer of why. In this picture of someone who would love so deeply that they would allow themselves to be tortured so that this little boy could have a life. So the next morning arises, and as the sun peeks out over the dawn, the girls rush to the table, and they're so sad, and they're seeing poor Aslan here, and they want to get some flowers and put on his body. But as the sun starts to peek up over the horizon, they hear this loud crash as they start to walk away. And the stone table is broken. And death no longer has hold on Aslan anymore. And Aslan is resurrected, just like Christ. So 3 days later, Aslan arises to go to battle. And it's the battle to get rid of the White Witch. Now, we're going to take this story because it had amazing imagery, but there was a whole plot that we're going to look at and how plots work. And that's today's topic, is plot motif structure. Every story has a problem. If it doesn't have a problem, it's not a story. It's a documentary. Okay? It is a thing you watch on PBS and you fall asleep to. So, every story must have a problem. And every one of the stories you talked about earlier, even though you didn't know it, you thought you were telling me about characters, you were actually telling me that they had a problem. Regina felt unloved. Rocky had lost the fight. Esther was not feeling brave and was not able to save her people. Who else did we have? We had another one. Scrooge was greedy and had no love. Every one of these people had, at the beginning of the story, a problem. Something had to change that problem. Otherwise, you'd just be doing your same humdrum activities. Okay? So, the first thing you have is called the, these do not work as well as exposition. Okay? The exposition. The exposition is exposing the problem. And every story has one. It's usually in the beginning. Sometimes it can be found in the first chapter. Sometimes it's found in the first page. But the exposition says, this is the way life normally is, and all of a sudden, one day something happens and there's a problem. Something changes the norm. And usually that's something bad. It can be something as easy as a child who is picked on. It can be something as bad as a bomb that is dropped. All right? But something has changed that causes a problem in the life of the character. That's the exposition. You have to determine what the exposition is. If you don't know what the exposition is, you won't know if at the end the story is complete. And it's not just because you ran out of pages. Okay? The exposition is, what is the problem? Next, you have the biggest part of the story. It's called the rising action. Now, if you've ever read a book and you said, I don't like reading because the books I read are slow and boring, it's because the rising action didn't rise all that much. Okay? So you might need to find a different type of rising action. Sometimes you'll have an author like Dickens who was paid, I think it was either by the word or by the line. And so his rising action is 900 pages. And you feel like you're going like this forever, and it's never really rising. You're doing a lot of running, but not a lot of rising. And you're reading and reading and reading and said, please get somewhere. So, if exposition here is, what is the problem? In this case, the problem is the witches in power. And they've come to Narnia, and they're stuck there. They're now in a place, and there is someone who showed compassion, and he's been taken by the witch, and she's in power, and this is horrible. They go to meet the beaver, and we'll put on here beaver, and they go to meet Aslan, and they go on an adventure. They actually go and do the majority of the book. Okay? Now this is called the rising action. This is almost all of your book. And it should be rising. Every challenge should be getting a little bit harder. Usually the first challenge is sort of easy for the hero to get by. Maybe they'll just hide real quick. Yes, we did. And then the next time they might actually come to something that takes a little bit more work. But by the time they hit the final obstacle, it should almost be so hard that it breaks the hero. At this point, now you're at your climax. The climax of the story. The best way to describe the climax is, yes, it's the pivotal part, it's the peak of the summit. The best way to describe climax is at this point you're yelling at the book, don't do it! And at that point you hit the climax. Why? Because you're screaming at the book now, trying to tell the characters what to do. Right? The climax is that moment where your heart starts racing and you just know something's about to happen. It's the final challenge. It is the final obstacle that the character has to go through. It is it's the life or death, the victory or the loss, the defeat. It's all resting on this last and final obstacle in the climax. As soon as the climax is over, usually we'll find something that means falling action. But because we're in college, we can't call it falling action. We'll have to use the French word for it. We'll call it the denouement. Okay? And that's actually its title, even in English class. Yes, it is. So you've got your exposition. So that starts the problem. What is the problem in the story? The rising action, all of the events that lead up to the climax. The final battle, the climax of the story. The denouement. This is, if you're reading Sherlock Holmes, this is the moment you find out it was Colonel Mustard in the library with the knife. It's the aha moment. It's the, ooh, I got it now. I see the picture. I see the moment. This is the denouement. All of a sudden now the action's falling. It's going to go right down to the conclusion. But the denouement is that moment of satisfaction where you're yelling, I knew it! Or, man, I never saw that one coming. That is a great one. Sometimes your denouement will be right before the words, the end. And that is a great book that keeps you guessing all the way to the last sentence. The climax, the denouement, and finally, the conclusion. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you have a conclusion that doesn't match your exposition, you feel rather cheated in the book. Because all of a sudden, the whole purpose of what you were doing has flopped. It has fallen flat. And now the plot, and we're going to talk about some different motifs and some devices the plot is going to use, but the whole point of the story is to fix the problem. Right? What happens at the end if you started in the Garden of Eden, and now there's sin, and at the end of it, they die? The end. We go, well, that just stunk. Where's the rest of the story? Or, if the guy gets mugged, and he meets somebody who's powerful, and the guy goes, no, that's just tough luck. Well, I'll do better next week. And the guy leaves, and the guy's still sitting there broke, and he gets mugged again the next day. You're really annoyed at the book. There's no follow-through. There's no solving the problem or the exposition. Okay? Titanic. Oh my goodness. Ready? We start on a beautiful ship. She's gorgeous. He's strong. He's courageous. Ready? Hold on. How does it end? I'm going to peel your dead, cold fingers off my raft. I'm not going to share it with you.
Good.
There you go down in the water. I'll remember you fondly while I have the jewels on my neck. Oh my goodness! You want to get up and scream at the theater.
And Celine Dion.
It's
singing the song.
and she's singing,
While
and you're actually annoyed at the credits. Why? Oh, hold on, it gets worse. first. Ready? What was the whole exposition of that story? If you saw the movie Titanic, why did they fly her out there in the first place? Because actually the story wasn't about the problem. The problem, the exposition, was not about her and him and the dying and the Titanic going down. That wasn't the exposition. What was the whole problem? What was the whole story about?
Find the diamond.
Finding the jewels. What does she do? And she's an old lady.
She's still burning.
Oops. She says the word oops. And at that point, you want to throw her overboard. Because the plot did not fulfill its job. The entire point of the movie, the job of the movie, the job of the story was for her to bring it out at the end and hand them over. The legacy, the story, the whole deal. You take it on now. But dropping the priceless jewels into the bottom of the ocean, just like her long-lost love that she sort of forgot too. All of a sudden you walk out there rather annoyed.
But it did. In the end, she died, and she was reunited with her long-lost love, and everybody else that died on the Titanic in that last scene.
In the last scene, as a memory, she was supposed to give up the jewels. That was the problem. Okay, let's bring one closer to home, because those of you who have teenagers, okay, you're going to be able to describe this one really well, okay? Have you ever read the books or seen the movies, The Hunger Games? You all heard of them? Katniss Everdeen, the arrow, or the archer? The whole point of three books, is to do one thing. Do you know what the one thing is? Saving the sister. The whole exposition starts when there's a reaping, and she's supposed to save the sister. And she says, I volunteer. I'll take my sister's place. This is the beginning of the first book. At the end of the third book, you expect, at the conclusion, the sister to her to be happily ever after, right? Living side by side. He's like, no, I don't want to hear the ending of this, okay? Spoiler alert, okay? Okay,
I
ready?
think I've seen that one, so I'll see it eventually one day.
Just go ahead and close it up, Chris, because, ready? You get really annoyed if what you were trying to prevent happened. If the whole point was to save the sister and she doesn't survive, what happens to the whole point of the book? The point of the book is defeated, and now your exposition has failed. Okay? Your problem has failed at that point. And so no matter what happens to the plot, no matter how great of a story, no matter how great the build-up, if the whole point to Luke Skywalker and coming off of Tatooine and fighting the Empire and the stormtroopers and getting the lightsaber, if at the very end Luke Skywalker dies and the Empire wins, you go, well, that's 6 hours I'll never get back. Because the bad guy's supposed to fall. That's the point of the story. Right? So you have to look at what is the goal of the story? What is the point? What is the exposition or the problem that is supposed to be done? In Scripture, what is the exposition of the Bible?